Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class this afternoon. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you for watching, whether you're watching with me live or you're watching the recording later on. As always, I just appreciate you watching. So as we get started today, just a couple of announcements. Since most of you are in the Web 215 class, you would have heard me talk yesterday about the IT Advising Day that happened yesterday. I'm gonna try to be in touch with all of you in the coming over the next week or so, just to make sure that we're all on the same page as to what you need for the spring. Make sure there's no surprises, all that kind of stuff, and just touch base with you all in general, just see how things are going, because it's been a long semester, and we're about midway through now, so we're getting pretty close to the end. So today, another announcement. I might be having to change the time of the live stream for this course. I've had something else that will occasionally need my attention at Wednesdays or on Wednesdays at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And I like these streams to be consistent, so I don't want to just change them on the weeks this would need my attention. I would want to change it regularly for the sake of consistency. But I'll be just putting that out in an announcement within the next few days as to whether or not we need to change these live stream times. I don't know that we will, but I wanted to make you all aware of that before we went into it. So today we're going to talk about typography, fonts. Because when we're talking about fonts, we're talking about a couple different things in relation to our website, and we're going to be approaching both of those today. One is that we're going to be talking about the theoretical side of why we use different fonts. And another thing that we're going to be talking about is the technical side, how we actually code the use of these different fonts on different sites. So that's going to be our main goal today. And we're actually going to look at multiple ways we can use different types of fonts on different sites when we get to our technical demonstration today. But first, I'd just like to talk a little bit about fonts in general. And as you're watching this right now, you might be sitting there thinking, Mr. Ramsey, is that a 4x3 PowerPoint presentation there? And yes, you'd be correct on that. This is a bit of an older one. The first time I taught the web design class here at CCC, I taught it as an adjunct. It was, goodness gracious, 7 years ago now? 8 years ago now? And when we talked about typography, we used this presentation, right? And believe it or not, it actually, on the theory side, it actually still holds up fairly well. We'll get to doing some of the practical stuff here in just a little bit as a demonstration, so you can see how exactly we can use different fonts in our website. So I think the first thing that we need to answer for ourselves is we need to answer ourselves a question of, well, what exactly is typography? And we can define this in a whole bunch of ways, right? Like, as we've been approaching this idea of web design, one of the big things that we've kind of breached in terms of ideas and web design is this fact that, well, when we're looking at this, we have a lot of different ways that we can describe a lot of things. Right, and all this different stuff has different purposes, and we're kind of moving through those phases now, right? In that build process, we started several weeks ago. When we first started the course, we moved into the idea of this like discovery phase and how this discovery phase impacted us for different purposes, and then we move into what we're kind of in now is this development phase, where we talk about different aspects of things that we can build and how we design and build things. So like last time, we were talking about our crap principles, and, that gets us some alignment and things of that nature when we're building wireframes and when we're building prototypes. And then from that, we add our type, and we make our type present on our website. And so, like, the most basic way that we can describe typography is just how we choose to display written content. And I think one of the important things to kind of point out there is the word choose. Typography is a choice, right? And it hasn't always really been this way, right? Way back in the day, typography on the web was incredibly limited, right? We have a list of what we call web-safe fonts that we'll look at in just a little bit as we start to approach the practical side of coding our type. And they've been kind of the only fonts that have been available to us for a long time, until like the last 15 years or so. And even still there initially, especially, using fonts online was hard. Using different fonts. You're oftentimes self-hosting fonts, and you're doing all this stuff. But in this case, we don't have to worry about a lot of that anymore. So we're making choices in terms of how we display our content with typography. And, I think the word choose here is important, because we talk a lot about doing things with intent in this course. That was a big topic, as we discussed last week, was approaching what we do with intent. So when we're building with intent and we're working with intent and we're choosing to use different fonts for our typography to display our written content, we're doing that with intent. And more than that, right, our font is kind of the voice of our website. If our words are kind of, what we're saying, then our font is our voice, right? And we can kind of picture it in our head right now. Right, like imagine going on, a serious, like, health science website, and it had this weird Comic Sans, like, curly Q font for all of its text. Right, like the content in that regard might be really good. It's really serious. It's probably really good information. But it's in this funny voice, right? Like imagine like someone standing up to give a eulogy at a funeral, and they're doing it in a Daffy Duck voice, right? Like when our content and our font that we choose to display that content with are kind of at odds with one another, that's where we have this instance where we have the voice that we're speaking with not match the words that we're saying. So we kind of want these things to align with one another, right? So we can have that sort of gravity, have that sort of I think consistency might be a good word there, like consistency of tone between the content and the font that you use to display. And it's really something that a lot of people don't think about oftentimes, is how a font in general comes across in relation to the content that you've written with that font. Even still, like at a collegiate level, from emails I get from other institutions or documents that I see passed around at like workshops, I'll see these documents or these emails written in Comic Sans, and there'll be this official, serious academic email about like changes to curriculum, but it'll be written in Comic Sans. So we have this dissonance, I think is a good word, between the voice that our content has and the content itself. And then the next thing that we can kind of define typography as is this sort of sum of its parts. right? So we can take typography and we can look at it as the individual parts of typography, the font, the spacing of that font, how readable that font is, and how usable in turn the content and the text makes the website. Right, and that word readability, and we'll revisit that word readability here in just a little bit. The word readability is a big deal, right? Because we want our websites to be readable, right? Especially if we're going to have a lot of content on our websites. Ideally, if we're approaching a website that has a lot of text on it, yes, then, ideally we want people to read that text. Right, so we want to present that text. How we choose to display that text needs to be displayed in a manner that supports readability. Online, and we'll talk more about this in just a little bit, that means a sans serif font. That means higher or larger, what we'd call in the print world leading, what we call in the digital world line spacing. Maybe a little bit of tracking, a little bit of kerning, a little bit of letter spacing, as we'd call it in the digital world. To kind of give our fonts a little bit of breathability, to give ourselves a little room so that when our users are reading the text, they're able to read it easily. And, they're not losing their place very often. They're not... rereading the same lines over and over and over again. Everything is formatted in such a way where it enhances readability. And, if they aren't formatted in such a way that enhances readability, then that is one of the things that can cause us to lose users. That's one of the things that we can have that will lead to an abandonment rate, right? Because if we have text that's difficult to read and we have just a whole big wall of text from the top to the bottom of the page, nobody's going to read that. Right? So, there is that. Now, I normally don't like to deal in absolutes, but I've chosen to deal in absolutes here. Because really, if your content is at the heart of your website, and your typography, how you choose to display this written content, is the voice of your website, and it's providing readability and usability to your website. This means, in turn, that if your type is bad, your design's bad. Right? So we need to spend some time sitting down with our type, thinking about our type, how we work with our type, and what we're doing there. So... because it is so critical, right? It's directly related to our content, especially if, we're using a lot of text, which, if you look around, a decent number of websites use a lot of text. Now, when we take and we break that up with images and videos and all this other stuff that we like to use to kind of help us add some multimedia and different things to our websites, when we use structures that help us organize data like lists and tables, that becomes a little less pertinent, right? We can kind of get by on maybe making just a slightly poorer decision than we would have otherwise. But since our content is at the core of our website and our type has such a big impact on our written content, if our type's bad, we've done a bad job. And I think finally, kind of just looking at typography from a different perspective here, is this idea that typography is a group of beautiful letters. Right? So it's more than just words. Right? We break down, when we visit a website, we see a wall of text. We see paragraphs, right? But we can break down those paragraphs to lines, and we break down those lines to words, and we break down those words to letters. And so, like, colloquially, when you hear people talking about typography and you hear people talking about watching typography videos, they're not watching videos like this one where people are talking about the idiosyncrasies of the types of fonts that we choose. You know, they're talking about calligraphy, or they're talking about drawing beautiful letter forms to kind of grab people's attention that way. So not only are we doing something that is for usability, but it also has a bit of aesthetic purpose to it as well. Right? And we can actually have a highly usable site utilizing this type of typography, and we can have, conversely, some typography that's just nice to look at. Right? Because that adds to the environment as well. So, you know, the way that we do that, we have to be kind of judicious with, you know, especially if it's something that we expect our users to read and be able to draw information from. But it is something that we can do, right? We can just make beautiful letters on our site. Now, we have several different types of fonts that we use here. And we see serif, right, and sans serif. These are the types of fonts that we are relatively used to, right? You know, we see serif fonts. The examples of serif fonts are things like you use for, typically for print applications, right? You see fonts like Times New Roman, right? As a serif font, these are the fonts that have the little pointy, jaggy pieces on it. Those pointy jaggies, they're called serifs. That's why we call them serif fonts. And they're kind of the first big iteration of fonts, because we can see that, you know, well, if our font has serifs, then we call it a serif font, but we don't have a term for fonts without serifs. We just call them sans serifs, or without serif. So we have our serif fonts, which have those little pointy bits. Our sans serif fonts, which don't have those pointy bits. Things like Helvetica and Arial and Verdana. And then we have some other fonts that could fall into these categories, depending on how they're written or how they're designed. But oftentimes, they're only useful in very specific instances. Right, like a headline font. Right, typically when we're thinking about a headline font, we're thinking about this like big, chunky type of font that's like thick and has it's like really dark and bold. Right, like think about things like Impact, or there's a lot of other fonts that kind of fall into this area that you might not know about. We'll look at some when we get on a font site here in just a little bit. But they're big and they're bold. And they look really good in like a heading level, right? Like a heading level 1 or a heading level 2, that sort of thing. But when you put them in like a paragraph, even though they might be set like a regular sans serif font, they have no serifs. But when you put something that bold and chunky in a paragraph, it diminishes the readability, right? So these are type of headline fonts, which is why we call them headline fonts. We use them for our headlines. They're good to grab attention for those headlines, and they're readable in short bursts. But when we're looking at them in a wall of text, we start to see issues. Even more so might be what we experience with calligraphic or handwritten fonts. And these are fonts that are kind of designed to look like cursive, designed to look like signatures, right? Like even like the web-safe fallback alternative for a calligraphic font is cursive, right? We use the term cursive. And so they're designed to kind of look like somebody's cursive writing. Our regular calligraphic fonts are, they're designed to look like a neat type of cursive writing, where somebody took their time and was doing, calligraphy and using special brushes and pens, and really getting into the art form. So all the letters are, nice and neat and have neat edges and all this kind of stuff. Whereas our handwritten fonts are oftentimes a little more loose, right? They look more like somebody's handwriting, hence handwritten. And finally, we have display fonts. These are the type of fonts that we usually see in, when we're thinking about a display font, we're thinking about like our programming window fonts or our command line window fonts. Oftentimes, these display fonts are monospaced, meaning every character takes up the same amount of space. And we typically see, there's typical things like, Consolas or I'm trying to think of the one that like everybody uses, but it's not coming to me off the top of my head. Right, so there are a lot of different options here in terms of just general types of fonts. Now, when we look at some of these, right, and here we see like a sheet with like the letter Q, and we can see just how many different letter Qs exist. There's a bunch of them. Right, and all of these here are essentially, there's a lot of serif fonts involved here. I think all of these might be serif fonts. But even in each of these fonts, we can see how different each of these letters are. And in seeing how different each of these letters are, we could start to see really what we're talking about when we're talking about that whole voice thing. Right? Like each of these letters really has a personality of its own. So they're all the same letter, but they all have a very different personality. And so we can kind of see these things and we can relate them to, like if we look at that Amazon font there, the third Q over on the top row versus the Bitstream Cooper Light right next to it. All right, those are two way different personalities. Right, like on the left there with the Amazon, that might be somebody who shows up to the school in like a full dress outfit, and our Bitstream Cooper Light's just a regular like jeans and t-shirt sort of day. Right, we can see completely different personalities here. Even for fonts that are kind of similar, like Bitstream Cooper Light and Aldous there, the second Q in the second row. Right, just little things like the descender line on the Q there being rounded at the end on the Bitstream Cooper Light versus squared off at the end on that Aldous font. Makes these subtle personality cues that really make a distinction between these different fonts in terms of the voice that they're providing to our website. So when we say choose, when we're talking about a choice, it really is a choice, and we need to treat it deliberately, and we need to treat it with intent. Just looking at another sort of slide here with some type, right? This is the kind of thing that we would see online nowadays, right? When you're looking at like font pages. This came back from back in the day when those didn't exist. Right, you'd get these books from a company when you were buying like trays of movable type for printing presses that, showed you all the letters, showed you all the letter combinations, showed you the alternate stylings and the glyphs, shows you the different point sizes that might be available to you. Like in this case, we have 72 point, we have 60 point, 48 point, looks like 36 point, 24 point, 18 point, 12, 10, 8, and 6. And we can see the impact of all these fonts here. This is a condensed sans serif. Number 5 was the name of this font. And really, it's a pretty nice looking font. I wouldn't mind using this font in a lot of my projects, just because I think it's a nice looking font. It's really readable. It doesn't take up a whole lot of space. All the letter forms are unique and English easily distinguishable. And we can see, like, if we look at the 10-point one there, like, in general, we say, like, don't get below 10, because then it starts to lose its readability. But when we're looking at 10-point there, that's easily read at that size. So we can look at this font here, and we can see that, it's a good font, and this is again an example of a sans serif font. We don't see those little pointy bits here, but we can see all the characters and how they interplay. It's a really nice font. And so we mentioned readability earlier, and we started talking about half of readability being if you are able to read the site. Right? So, if you can go to a site and even if it has a big wall of text, if it's formatted in such a way where it gives you that kind of breathing room, it gives you, these visual places where you can kind of rest your eyes and stop for a moment, by giving you this like higher line spacing or this just these breaks between paragraphs or whatever. Larger characters, a larger font size is always preferable. Right, so if you're able to read the site, if you have a readable font that has all of these properties that we just mentioned, that is 1/2 of readability. And that's really the part of readability that you can control the easiest. And it is also the part of readability that is directly related to typography. So that's why it's the big one that we mention in this presentation. However, conversely, there's another side to readability. It's the idea of wanting to be able to read the site. And this is a little more difficult to control, right? Like it's kind of like we were saying back at the beginning where we said UX design is magic, because we can't actually make people have a good experience. We can only create an environment in which a good experience is likely to happen. We can't make people want to read the site, but we can create our typography and write our type in such a way, write our content in such a way that people want to read the site. We created that environment again, right? Because a lot of what we do in terms of web design revolves around the idea of environment and being able to create this environment. So what does it mean to want to read a site, right? Like you go to a website with purpose, right? You go to a website with the purpose to get the information, whatever that information may be. So you're already going in with that goal as a user, right? So it would seem to be that this would be kind of a slam dunk for the designer in this case, right? Like the user has the problem that they need this content, and we're just going to give it to them. We're going to give them this content. We're just going to lay it all out there for them. But especially in 2021, there are a lot of places to get content. There are a lot of places to read things, to watch things, to do things. There are a lot of places online. And it's highly likely that some of those places have the same content. So if I get on your site and I'm looking for this content and I see just a bunch of tight lines, crammed together wall of text that looks like it's going to take me forever to read, right there, just immediately, I might close the browser window. You might get a raised abandonment rate from me because I'm going to close the browser window and I'm not going to come back. I'm going to go find another site that also has that information, that chose to present it to me in a better way. And that's before I even read word 1. Right, so then when we get into that, we start to see these other things, right, like reading level can play into this as well. Right, and by and large, we hear like a lot of people talk about general reading level for like technical documentation, for example. General reading level for that is between like 9th and 12th grade, right? Like there's a lot of fluctuation on that. But if we think about reading level for creating a website, like we would think about reading level for a newspaper, right? And again, a lot of this is going to come from like knowing our audience. If our audience is different, like if we have a different segment of the population that is the audience for this site, we don't necessarily have to follow this rule. But if it's a general public site, we might want to think along the same lines in terms of readability for reading level that newspapers do. So when a newspaper is considering writing for reading level, the majority of newspapers that you'll run into are writing to a 6th grade reading level. Just because, you know, we're wanting to cast out a wide net, we have a lot of different people of different reading abilities coming to our site. And even in general, like if we're able to convey a message using simpler words, that's just going to be better, and that's just going to be better as it is. Right? I don't have to think as hard while I'm reading, which is wonderful. Right? So we want to maybe follow in the footsteps of newspapers in this instance and write toward a 6th grade level. And there are actually applications, there are things that you can get online, like the Hemingway app, that can actually tell you what the reading level of the content that you've written is. And you know, there are these little plugins that you can put into Microsoft Word and all this other sort of stuff that can tell you this reading level. So really, when we get into the development of all this, we're considering it from this perspective of not only people kind of being able to read it, but people wanting to read it. And the more obfuscation, the more confusion, the more barriers that we kind of introduce to what we've written, whether it be visually with how we've handled the font, or in the content with how we've handled, you know, writing the content toward a reading level and all that kind of stuff. That want is dictated by so many things. Like I recall several years ago now, it's probably been about 10 years ago. It was around the time when it was super popular. So I don't even remember necessarily when that was right off the top of my head. But I wanted to get on the bandwagon and read Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code. Right, I wanted to read the Da Vinci Code because everybody else in the world was reading it. And, you know, talking about how great it was. And so I said, you know what, I'll give it a shot. Like, they got the book at this store. I'll pick it up. I'll read it. And we'll see what it's like. About a page and a half in, I go, this is garbage. I put it down. I walk away from it. It was so poorly written to me that I was like, no, thank you. And I abandoned it. And I never came back to it. So this is that other half of readability here. Not just that our font is right, but that our content is right as well. And these things work hand in hand, right? The content is the word and our fonts are the voice. So we do have some best practices here for utilizing good web type. One is that bigger is better. Right, and in the majority of websites that I work with, right, I always take and make the font size bigger, even if it's just a little bit bigger. Like even if we're just taking it and pushing it to like 1.2 rem, where it's just like 20% larger than the regular font size, then that's great. You know, 1.3, 1.4, 1.6. just make it a little bit bigger, right? Like that's not only going to have benefits for kind of making it a little bit friendlier and a little bit easier to read, because you can say, well, there's a decent amount of text here, but, the font's pretty big, right? Like, how many times have you said that when you've had to read books for school? Like, how many times have you been told that? Like, oh, it's a 200-page book, but it's got a big font. Okay, cool. So, it's not so bad, right? So not only does it help us with that, but it also helps with accessibility issues, right? If we have a bigger font, that just makes it easier to read in general. So people who have, low vision problems don't have to, zoom in as much on a bigger font than they would on a smaller font. Lots of benefits there. One is don't cram your lines together. Just kind of give them a little bit of space. Use that line spacing, CSS property, and give them just a little bit of space. One is, then we have when we're making it attractive and readable. Oh, let me go back to a point on that previous line, don't cram your lines together. The longer your line is, the more space that you want between your lines. Right? Because this is not only just going to help provide that breathing room, but this is also going to help your user with tracking the text. Right? Because you have a visual separation between the line they're reading, the previous line, and the next line. Right? So when you have a bunch of long lines that are kind of crammed together like that, that's the time when you often end up reading the same line multiple times, or end up maybe skipping a line or skipping to a different place, because everything's kind of jumbled together and you lose that ability to track through the text. So let me just make sure to go back and throw that in there, because that's a big deal when it comes to why we wouldn't want to cram our lines together. Making it attractive and readable, going back to that previous slide where we talked about readability and the two parts of readability, one of them being just the fact that it's nice and neat and looks like it can be read easily, right? Appearances could be deceiving, right? You could have a lot of big words and a lot of confusing language that makes it, tough to read for that second half of readability. But if you put in effort and make it look like it can be read relatively easily, then, at the very least, that'll add a few minutes to the clock before you get that abandonment. Consider your user, right? We've mentioned that to some degree, right? Like your user is going to dictate the type of content that you write. It's going to dictate that grade level. It's going to dictate that voice you need to talk in. If your users are expecting you to be, serious and business professional, that's one thing, right? If your users are expecting you to be, light and fun and, having a good time, that's an entirely other thing. Right? And then finally is contrast, right? Like ideally, we kind of always want our fonts to be white font or black font on white background, right? Because that's the most contrast. And high contrast improves readability, right? Like we talk about it in terms of accessibility in our other courses. Like when we're working in Web 115, we talk about contrast and contrast ratios for accessibility. In general, we have a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1 for standard size fonts on websites, which you can push that a lot. And you can use that to kind of get creative with the colors. But the lower that contrast ratio is, the more difficult it kind of is to discern the foreground and the background. So if you're an individual with low vision who can't see very well, or if you're an individual who has some form of color blindness, which could also be impacted by our contrast issues here, that contrast where that foreground and background are close to one another in brightness is going to muddy the waters. It's going to make things more difficult to read. So that's how we see that contrast show itself in terms of readability. Now, let's look at how we work with fonts. So here, I have us a little website. You know, it's just a really little sample website here. This is what it looks like on the live server. Lots of sites here for us to visit in just a bit. Let me go full screen with this. But this is just a really basic little website template that I put a little bit of text on. And for our purposes here, one of the things that I'm going to do right now is I'm going to take and I'm going to duplicate, oops, wrong window. I'm going to take and duplicate that line just a little bit here. So we have many more sentences inside of our paragraph here, just so we have a nice big paragraph. So we'll just put lots of text in here, like that. So this text is gibberish, but you can probably see now that, you know, the line width here is fairly long. And this is probably a good visual for you to kind of understand how that impact of that line width and the font size, you know, it has on readability. And, you know, like I'm looking at it in different zooms on my different monitors now, right? Like on one monitor, I have my streaming software that has it at one zoom level. On my main monitor, I have it as the full-size site. And on my left-hand monitor, I have it on the little YouTube preview window just to make sure everything is streaming right. And so I'm seeing it at different zoom levels. And, you know, of course, in the middle, I can read it okay, right? It's a little tough to read just because everything's kind of crammed together there. But in my streaming software window, like it's really hard to read, but I can still kind of read it. In my YouTube preview there where it's tiny, it's impossible. So these are our default fonts as we're working with web development, right? It's just Times New Roman. That's the default for an H1 that you see there at the top. And that's the default for a paragraph that you see in the middle. So let's just change some of our standard font CSS and work with it here. So we'll make it a little bit better, and then we'll change the font, and then we'll do something else. So all of our text is in our main, right? But I want to focus our H1, and I want to focus our paragraph. So let's have those two rule selectors here. And so in the H1 here, you can see that I've already aligned the text. I've used our text align center here. And I've given it a little bit of margin on the bottom, right? Like this is just a standard, like basic website template that I use for a lot of different sites, just so we could have something quick and easy for a demo here. But the font size of our H1 is a default font size. So we could we could just make it a little bit bigger, right? Like we could say, oh, let's make this 1.4 font dash size is 1.4 rem. And that'll make it bigger. And I've got this on live server here, so I won't save this quite yet. So I'll just show this to you again so you can see it. And then I will save here. And we'll go back. And oh, that's a little smaller, right? Because our H1, our rem is based off our regular font size, but our H1 is based off an enhanced font size. So let's make it a lot bigger. Let's make it like a 4. Now we'll save that. There we go. There's something nice and big. Now one of the things that we see here is like if we resize this, it won't resize. Right, it'll stay that size, but we could also use like a viewport width in our font size here, and that would take each letter and make it that size of the viewport width. Or we could use a percentage there, and that would take each letter and make it that percentage. So like if we took our font size and we made it like 2%, that's real tiny. But if we made it like 40%, it should be too big. Right, actually, it might not like percentages. and our fonts 8. But we can definitely use viewport width. So like if we use 3 viewport width, let's use viewport width instead. If we use 3 viewport width, each letter is 3% of the width of the viewport. So if we change the size of our viewport, like so, we see that gets smaller. Right, in other classes where we've talked about RWD, this is something that we can do, and we'd add like a media query in there to change it where it gets at sizes where it gets too small. Right, so let's look at the paragraph here, because the paragraph's where we can do more stuff. By default, we're going to want to make that font just a little bit bigger, so let's make it font size 1.4 M. And really, I should have used M instead of Rem on the H1, because that would have done it in relation to its normal size instead of in relation to the base size. So let's just look at that really quickly. Right, we'll comment that out there. Comment that out there. If I say the font size, so let's save this. If we look at the heading, there's a little preview there of our. But if we look at the heading and we make this font size 1.4 M instead of Rem, we see that there. It's kind of the same in this instance, but it's in relation to its usual size. We can bump that up to like 8 to give ourselves a little bit of contrast. Although, for contrast's sake, we'd want to bump this up like a lot, for like a 2.2. So, oops, that's the wrong one. 2.2 here. And that'll give us a decent amount of contrast. All right, so we can see our lines here, especially when we made them a little bigger here. Like, it's a little bit easier to read. Like, I can read it more easily on my scaled down version here on my right. I can almost read it in my teeny tiny thumbnail view here on the left. But let's just add a little line spacing here, and that's with our line spacing, or line height property, line height, text spacing, line height. And we can add just a little bit of additional line height to that. So maybe 1.6 M we'll add here. So it's a little bit over double spaced is what we're looking at here. Right, and we see that there. We have this extra line spacing in between our lines. We can make that even bigger. And actually, that's not technically a little over double space, because double spaced in this case would be 2.4 or 2.8 M. So if we wanted to double space our website, we would go 2 times the font size, which would double space us, which looks pretty cool, right? Like, that's not bad. But you can definitely see here how that reading, that space there gives us a little bit extra reading room, and how that makes it easier kind of for us to track. We can also do like kerning and stuff like that with our letters, with our letter spacing. Letter spacing, we can just make it just a little bit bigger than normal, so maybe 1.2 M. Let's just see what that looks like. That's a little too much, because that's our space between the letters. So maybe we want to go something like, let's cut that in half. Let's call that 0.6 M. Right? These are things that you play with until you really get them right. Still too big. Let's do 0.2 M. We'll save that. That looks a little bit better. Right? We can get that letter spacing in there just to make it a little bit nicer. And we can do that on everything. Like, we might want to add more letter spacing on our bigger font here. So we might want to take our H1, add some letter spacing to it, and maybe make it like 0.3 M. And check that out, right? Like, so we get that sort of effect there, which is pretty cool. Right, so that's pretty cool, but by default here we're only left with this Times New Roman font. So we want to look at some different options as to how we can add different fonts to our website. And one of the easiest ones is through WebSafe Fonts. And our W3C resource here is kind of the best resource for us to kind of look at WebSafe fonts. So that's what I'm going to use for this. We've got a total of like 10 or so web-safe fonts that we can just put into our sites by default. We see that list here. And we see they have them listed out by sans serif, serif, monospace, which we were also calling display earlier, and cursive, which we were also calling calligraphic or handwriting fonts earlier. So in the sans serif, we have Arial, we have Verdana, we have Helvetica, and we have Tahoma, and we have Trebuchet. And these are all of our sans serif web-safe fonts, and these are all fonts that we can just put into the font family property by default, and we get those fonts. In our serif fonts, we have Times New Roman, we have Georgia, we have Garamond, we have Courier New as the monospace font. That's the kind of font that you might see in like a command line prompt. And then we have Brush Script as our cursive font. So let's just look at one of these. Let's just look at one of these sans serif fonts. Because in general, for body copy, you like to use sans serif fonts. Just because for online reading, sans serif fonts work a whole lot better. So let's take and make our body copy in our paragraph there one of these sans serif fonts. Maybe we can try a couple. Maybe we can try both Verdana and Tahoma just so we can see the difference. And we'll do that in our paragraph here. So we'll add a font-family, colon, and we'll add Verdana here first. Now, typically when we're doing these font families, if for whatever reason the font fails to load, we also like to have a backup here. And so in most cases, we'll just write the generic version of the font, whether it's serif, sans serif, monospaced, or cursive here. So in this case, this is sans serif. So we'll put that there as the backup just in case Verdana fails to load. But it won't. Right? So now we saw what it looked like before. Right? With our serif Times New Roman font. When we save this, it switches to our sans serif Verdana. And even still, you can see here kind of how that sans serif font is more readable. Which one did we say we'd change it to? Tahoma, I think, just to see which one we liked better. Let's change Verdana here to Tahoma. Save that. And there's that difference, right? It's just a slight difference. In this instance, I might like Tahoma just a little bit better. I've been on a bit of a Verdana kick lately. But I might like for Tahoma here just a little bit better. But we can see the readability of it here. And now, that might be too much for your purposes, right? You might want to make the letter spacing a little smaller. Right? You might want to make that line height a little shorter. I think in this case, the letter spacing doesn't really have to be that big. Like this 0.1 M letter spacing is fine. I think since these lines are a little longer, we do want the line spacing to be a little bit more here. Maybe 2M might be enough. That looks pretty good, right? Just a little bit, just to give it a little bit more readability. And I actually think the font might be just a little big, or really it's probably big in comparison because our header here is just kind of small. So we might want to make that header a little bit bigger. Maybe shrink that letter spacing down a little bit there as well. Right, so that gets us a good body copy there. And in general, body copies like that are fine. Right, but what about this H1? What can we use for this H1? Well, for that, let's use something that's just a little bit different. Let's browse our Google Fonts. So fonts.google.com, you have access to Google Fonts. This is like a CDN for fonts, where we can use all of these fonts on our website. Let's switch this to dark mode, just so it's a little easier on our eyes. And let's find us a font to use for that headline. One of the things that I like to do for purposes of contrast is I like to use those big, chunky headline type of fonts. And when we're talking about those, if we look at our categories here, we see they categorize a lot of them as being display fonts. Right, like I look at them a little bit differently, but in this case, they categorize them as display fonts. So I can look at the display fonts and we can see all these big chunky fonts. And since I have a sans serif for the body copy, I might want to use a serif chunky font like this one here, this Fa21, for my site. And so we can look at it here. This is kind of like that glyph sheet that we looked at earlier when we were looking at that printed one. And we can look at all the about and the license information here. We see that it's got an open font license, so we can use them however we want to use them. That's the great thing about all the Google fonts. When we find something that we want, right, because some of them might have additional weights attached to them, we can click the select this style button to select the style. Right, and so that adds a font into my selected fonts, and it gives me a little bit of CSS code that I can use. I can take this link code and I can paste it in the HTML for my site, or I can use the import code and put it in the CSS of my site. Now you see it has the style tags here. You don't need those if you're working in a style, if you're working in a style sheet, a separate style sheet. But I'm going to take and I'm going to copy that. And I'm going to take and put it at the start of my style sheet up here above my reset rules. So now when it loads my style sheet, it's going to import that style sheet from Google, which tells it, hey, he can use this font. So now all I have to do is find my H1, add the font family here, and that font family is listed. If we go back here, this is Fa21. We can see here it also gives us the font family code. I can just copy it from there. It lists the fallback for that as cursive. I wouldn't necessarily want to use that. So you might just have the fallback be serif here. Right, so it'll fall back to Times New Roman or whatever, right? And so now we're calling it from Google. We're putting it into our font family here. And if we go back to our site, we can see it present here. And so we can see some nice contrast between this headline font and this body font. Now, we have one more way that we can get a font, and that is by hosting it ourselves. So one of the things that I found, I just went on Dafont.com, which is a free font website. I encourage you all to look at the license information for these fonts. Like one of the reasons why I picked this PW News Arrows is one, we could use it as like as a glyph, you know, for different call outs and stuff like that. But two, it is free for both commercial and personal projects, so we can use this however we want. And we need to have a little bit of leeway because we need to be able to convert this font. Because we can see here by default, all we get is a true type font, a .ttf font file. But we can take any .ttf font or any .otf font, and we can convert them to a web font style, which is our WOFF or WOFF2 font. So what we're going to do here is we're going to download this font, and we're just going to go ahead and unzip it. So we'll just give it a second here to unzip. Give pzip a minute to open here. We'll extract it, extract all, put it in a folder, do its thing. And there we go. There's our font. All right, we got a TTF font, which we can't use inside of this folder here. So we need to be able to convert it to a WOFF or WOFF2. There's plenty of websites like this that exist. This is Transfonter, transfonter.org. There are several other websites like this that are fine, that are good to use. We can add our fonts here. In this instance, we can just grab our PW News Arrow font here. It'll give you like additional code if you fill out some of this stuff here to where you don't have to worry about it. Right, but all you need to do is upload the font that you're going to be downloading, choose WOFF or WOFF2, and click Convert. And it'll give you a little font face kit that you can download. Good, so now let's unzip that. So you'll notice here that it gives you a little demo of what the font looks like. We can open that up and have a look at it, right? We can see all of our arrows here. In doing so, it also gives us like the code that we would need here as well, which is pretty cool. Right, so this is one of the things we could just go ahead and use this information from here. Right, so before we do this, all we'd really want to do is just take this WOFF2, copy that, put it in our project folder, and then we can just use this code here. So this is a preload link here, so we just take that, copy it, put it in the head of our HTML. We just put it right here below our CSS file. That'll preload that font. We might want to pull that above our CSS file, like that. And let's just at the bottom down here below our paragraph, let's just add a span with a random letter in it. Like let's just go uppercase F. I'm not sure what character that is in this font, but we'll go with it. Right, so if we go back over to our demo site, we've got a random F character down here at the bottom. Right, so now we can also copy in this style sheet here. We're not going to copy it in with the Your Style class here, because we don't need that. We'll just copy the inside of it. We'll get in our CSS, and we'll focus our span for that. So that's span, and we'll put all that font information in there. So now when we check out our page, still an F. Right, so what else do we need to do? Well, the other thing that we need to do here is we need to put that font family as a font family rule in our CSS, right? Like if you look here, we have a little style sheet.css file here. So what we want to do here is we want to create a font family, which we do that with @font-face. Right, and we can see that our good friend Emmett actually fills out a lot of that for us. So we can, here we can call this PW News or PW New Arrows. Whatever we call it here is the font family we can use elsewhere. And we'll just add the source link here, which is the source link to our font, which we'll just grab from here and put it here in quotes. So now that font should be appearing on our site. You can see we have a little arrow here. So I made my body position here relative so we can kind of move this arrow around, right? Like I can make this a position fixed And I can move it around, top, left, bottom, right. I can make the font size a lot bigger. Like I can make it a font size 4 rem or whatever I want to do here. Just to make it huge. I can make it a nice bright color. Like let's just make it bright red. Save that. Right now we've got this. Where did it go? We might need to let's remove that position fixed for just a second, because I think that's what's causing our problem here. Yep, see, so there's our arrow. I should probably put, oh yeah, it's on the body instead of the, so it'd probably be smarter for us to put it on the main, our position relative on the main, since, so then that would become the most nearly positioned parent, although that would break some stuff. Yeah, it's fine. We'll leave it on the body. And we'll position fixed this. Or actually, we could just position relative this. And just make it relative to where it normally is. It normally would be in the flow. And now we can start to move it. Like we can move it left minus 15 pixels. Right, we can just kind of watch it move a little bit. Let's go minus. Well, actually, what's our padding here? What's our padding on our main? Padding is 1.8 rem. So we can move it like maybe minus 2 rem to combat that padding, to kind of push it outside. So we can see that our tail starts outside of the box and goes into the box, kind of pointing to the text and pointing back up. Right, we can make this font a lot bigger. Like we can go 8 rem here. We can just make this a nice big arrow. Right, we can see that, you know, maybe we want it kind of look like, you know, somebody started off the outside there and moved in. So maybe we go to like 1.9 rem here and work with that, or 1.8 rem here and work with that. You know, just whatever, right? We can chip away at it and figure out what we want here and make it nice. And so that's that. Right? If we wanted this font not to be readable for the purposes of like accessibility and stuff, well, we could put that in an after. Right? So we can put a little after on our span. So let's have our span, and let's just put a little after on it, and let's just put the content here. Let's just take all this stuff from here, just put it in our after, and we'll add our content. In this case, our content will be, we'll use another letter here just so it's different, like uppercase H maybe. Let's put that in quotes. So now we have that other arrow there, and as you can see, when I highlight it, it'll highlight that first arrow we did because it's in the body, whereas the second arrow that we have here is an after. And we can also move it accordingly. Like if we want to move it to the right some, well, we can just up that left value since we're positioning it relatively anyway, and we can move it wherever we want it to go. And we can even take the top value and just put it up like in. And we can go top like minus 12 rem and just put it up in the text somewhere, right? And maybe we can take and we can try z-indexing it, z-index -1, just to do something interesting with it. Although that takes it and that puts it down below the main as well, so we'd have to z-index more for that to really work. But, you know, you get where I'm going here, right? You get where I'm going here. You get all the ways that we can use this. So now we've seen 3 different ways that we can use web fonts from different sources. We've seen how we can put them into a site. And we've talked a lot about our best practices for using web fonts. So really, that's all that I have for you today. I'll hang out in the chat for just a couple minutes, just in case anybody has any questions. If you're watching this later and you have any questions, please contact me. Please let me know. But thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.